If you've flown anywhere in America in the last 10 years, odds are you sat on a bright yellow plane and complained about it. The seats didn't recline, the bag cost extra, and almost everyone flew it anyway, because it was cheap. Then, in the early hours of May 2nd, 2026, Spirit Airlines began an immediate shutdown and canceled every remaining flight. By the time most workers found out overnight, about 17,000 jobs were gone. Roughly 14,000 were direct Spirit employees, and thousands more were contractors and airport staff. Left behind were more than 100 Airbus jets, most of them leased and parked across the country, with no airline to fly them. It was the first major U.S. airline to collapse in about 25 years. It didn't arrive with a crash, it arrived with an overnight shutdown. This is the story of how the airline that made flying cheap for almost everyone ran out of cheap. Chapter 1. The airline that taught America to fly for the price of a tank of gas. For more than 3 decades, Spirit sold one thing better than almost anyone else in the sky: the lowest possible fare. It built what the industry calls an ultra-low-cost carrier, which is just a fancy way of saying it stripped the ticket down to the bone. You paid a tiny base fare to get on the plane, then you paid for everything else, one piece at a time. A carry-on bag, a seat assignment, a printed boarding pass, a cup of soda. Nothing was included, and that was the entire point. The math was deliberately blunt. The fare that got you in the door could be shockingly low, sometimes just a few dozen dollars, and then the fees stacked up from there. On a Spirit ticket, the sticker price and the final price were 2 very different numbers. If you packed light and skipped the extras, you could cross the country for less than the cost of a tank of gas. If you didn't, the fees could quietly add up to more than a normal ticket. Spirit didn't hide this. It built its whole business on the gap between the price that got your attention and the price you actually paid. That earned it a reputation. People called it a nickel-and-dime airline. They joked about the seats that didn't recline and the soda that wasn't free. Spirit became a punchline in a way that almost no other airline ever was. The big airlines hated talking about it, because Spirit forced them to compete on price anyway. When Spirit opened a new route, fares on that route tended to fall, often even for travelers who would never set foot on a yellow plane. Researchers gave that ripple a plane name. They called it the Spirit effect. So here's the part that's easy to forget now, standing over the wreckage. For most of its life, Spirit was not a failure. At its peak, it was one of America's largest ultra-low-cost carriers, often described as the country's 7th largest airline. It flew tens of millions of people a year who might otherwise never have flown at all. A college kid heading home for the holidays, a grandmother flying across the country for a birthday, a warehouse worker visiting family 2 states over on a budget that had no room for a $400 ticket. For a lot of these people, the choice was never Spirit versus a nicer airline. It was Spirit versus not going at all. That was the promise. Stripped bare and sold cheap. Anyone can fly. But a business built entirely on being the cheapest carries almost no cushion when its own costs rise. Every dollar of margin had already been sanded away to win the fare. For most of its history, that was Spirit's genius. By 2024, it was about to become the thing that killed it. Chapter 2. The night the only exit door slammed shut. For a while, Spirit believed it had found a way out. Back in 2022, 2 airlines actually fought to buy it. Frontier made the first move, and then JetBlue won the bidding war with an offer worth about $3.8 billion. For a carrier that hadn't posted a full-year profit since 2019, that deal looked less like ordinary expansion and more like a possible lifeline. A merger meant the debt, the thin margins, the grounded planes, all of it could become a bigger and stronger company's problem. JetBlue's pitch was simple. To grow big enough to challenge the giants, it argued, it needed Spirit's planes and Spirit's crews. The 2 sides spent a month in a Boston courtroom in late 2023 making that case. Then everyone waited for the judge. Then came January 16, 2024. On that day, a federal judge in Boston named William Young blocked the merger. He agreed with the Justice Department's argument that letting JetBlue swallow Spirit would erase the country's biggest budget airline. That, the government said, would push fares higher for the very people who could least afford it. The reasoning was built to protect consumers. For Spirit, the effect was a sentence. Spirit's stock fell about 47% on the day of the ruling, and roughly 62% over the next 3 trading days. Wall Street had run the numbers out loud and reached a verdict. Without a buyer, this company could not survive on its own. Within days, analysts were openly using a word the company did not want to hear, which was bankruptcy. The 2 airlines filed an appeal, talked up a plan to refinance the debt, and tried to project confidence. None of it held. By March 2024, JetBlue and Spirit officially called the whole thing off. Now look at the box Spirit was standing in. It was losing money. It had roughly $1.1 billion in debt coming due in 2025, with no easy way to refinance it. And the one door marked exit had just been bolted from the outside. For years, the whole strategy had quietly assumed a buyer would eventually appear. Surviving completely on its own was never really the plan. The day that became the only option left, the clock started running, and everyone in the industry could hear it ticking. Here is the cruel symmetry of that courtroom. The judge closed the merger to keep cheap fares alive for travelers, and in closing it, he helped ensure the cheapest airline in America would not live to offer them. That ruling is the hinge of this whole story. Before January 16th, Spirit was a struggling company with a plan. After it, Spirit was a struggling company, alone, inside a locked room. What happened next happened in that room, with the costs climbing the walls. Chapter 3. Same runway, opposite destinies. To understand why Spirit died, it helps to stand next to an airline that started in almost the same place and lived. Southwest Airlines also began as the scrappy, low-fare upstart, the carrier that flew you cheap and never apologized for it. But Southwest built its edge on operations, not just on the sticker price. One type of plane, fast turnarounds, a machine engineered to keep costs low, even when the lowest fare wasn't the only thing it was selling. Spirit chased a different edge. It chased the bottom. When your only promise is being the cheapest, your product becomes interchangeable, and price is the only thing left to fight over. That works beautifully right up until your costs rise, and then it becomes a trap. Same runway, 2 airlines, opposite destinies. And in the end, Spirit's costs didn't simply rise, they piled on, one heavy lock at a time. First, the planes themselves turned against it. Spirit was heavily exposed to Airbus A320neo family jets, powered by Pratt & Whitney's geared turbofan engines. Those engines carried a manufacturing defect that became a major operational problem. Through 2024, Spirit expected an average of somewhere in the mid-20s of its aircraft to sit grounded waiting for inspection. That number climbed from about 13 planes in January toward roughly 40 by December, and the disruption dragged on toward 2026. An airline that only earns money when planes fly cannot survive a chunk of its fleet bolted to the tarmac. Second, the demand never fully returned. Spirit had been bleeding cash since the start of 2020, losing more than $2.5 billion in the years that followed. The budget leisure travelers it lived on never came back at the pace it needed. Third, the debt came due. More than $1 billion in loans matured, and a company losing money has very few honest ways to find $1 billion. Fourth, the industry had quietly closed ranks. The big 4 carriers, American, Delta, United, and Southwest, control more than 3/4 of all U.S. airline seat capacity. In a market that concentrated, a small discounter has almost no room to grow its way out of a hole. Now watch the locks turn together, because this is the whole machine. The engine defect drained the cash. The weak demand kept fresh cash from coming in. The debt demanded money that wasn't there. And with the big 4 owning most of the seats in the sky, there was nowhere left to expand toward. Each problem made the next one heavier, and the wheel kept turning in one direction only, down. So, Spirit filed for bankruptcy in November 2024. Then it filed a second time in August 2025. By late that year, it had furloughed hundreds of pilots and moved to cut close to 1/3 of its flight attendants. It warned investors of a 2025 loss of about $804 million. The company was already on its knees. It needed just one more thing to go wrong. Chapter 4. 17,000 goodbyes sent at 3 in the morning. That one more thing came from the other side of the world. When conflict in the Middle East sent jet fuel prices sharply higher in early 2026, the bill landed fast. Spirit incurred roughly $100 million in additional fuel costs across March and April alone. In some markets, prices nearly doubled within weeks. For a company with no cushion left, that bill was the end. In the final days, there was one last hope, a proposed federal rescue worth roughly $500 million. It could have handed taxpayers a huge stake in the airline. Those talks fell apart. In a court filing, Spirit's own chief financial officer, Fred Cromer, described it without drama. The company, he wrote, had fought valiantly for months to reorganize, and having all but succeeded. Now it was left with no choice but an orderly wind down. According to a union message sent to crews, the shutdown was set for 3 a.m. Eastern Time on May 2, 2026. Workers learned overnight that Spirit was finished. A flight attendant who had spent nearly 20 years at Spirit later said she found out it was over from a single overnight message. No warning, no meeting, no chance to brace for it. The same week, she should have been marking her 20th anniversary. Instead, she was doing the math on how to make a final paycheck stretch and learning her health benefits were already disappearing. She was one of about 17,000 people. Roughly 14,000 worked directly for Spirit, and thousands more were contractors and airport workers whose paychecks depended on those yellow planes showing up. The passengers woke up to the same shock. Over the next month, Spirit had something like 300 flights and around 60,000 travelers booked every single day. That came to close to 9,000 flights and roughly 1.8 million passenger trips in all. In a single night, every one of them turned into a problem to solve. Departure boards filled with cancellations, and rival airlines scrambled to offer rescue fares to people stuck far from home. The map of it is brutal. More than 3,200 of those jobs vanished in South Florida, where Spirit was headquartered. About 1,000 in Las Vegas, 1,600 more in Orlando. A company more than 3 decades old, gone in the length of a single night. And the planes became the strangest monument of all. Court filings counted a fleet of 114 Airbus A320 family jets, about 2/3 of them leased, and now wanted back by their owners. They sat parked at airports across the country, bright yellow, perfectly able to fly, and finished. To take the airline apart, Spirit won court approval for a wind-down plan. A small team would stay on to sell off planes and engines, return the leased jets to their owners, and close the company down. It now takes months of work and a budget in the hundreds of millions just to bury an airline that promised to fly you for the price of dinner. A bankruptcy judge approved the liquidation, and the dismantling began. The collapse didn't end with a fireball. It ended with silence on a tarmac, and about 17,000 people staring at a phone in the middle of the night. Chapter 5. Who pays when the cheap seat disappears? Here's the question that outlives Spirit. When the cheapest seat in the sky disappears, who ends up paying for it? For a few days after the shutdown, both the big airlines and the surviving low-cost carriers moved to look like rescuers. They capped fares on old Spirit routes and offered help to stranded travelers. United capped fares for 2 weeks and Delta for 5 days. JetBlue and Southwest offered 72-hour relief windows. American, Frontier, Allegiant, and others rolled out their own rescue fares. Read those numbers again because they quietly tell you everything. The kindness came with an expiration date. Once the temporary caps lift, some of the downward pressure that Spirit used to put on fares is likely to weaken. That is especially true on the leisure routes, where it was a major competitor. Analysts expect the biggest impact in leisure-heavy markets, where Spirit had been especially visible. Think Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, and Las Vegas, places where it once carried a large share of budget travelers. The Spirit effect, in other words, may run in reverse. The same ripple that once dragged fares down could now relax, and the people most likely to feel it are the ones who were already counting every dollar. So the future forks into 2 roads. On the first road, another low-cost carrier rises to claim Spirit's territory. A Frontier, an Allegiant, or some new name in some new color steps into the gap. The downward pressure on fares comes back, and the budget traveler keeps a seat. The yellow plane simply gets repainted, and the experiment continues under new management. On the second road, no one steps up, at least not at Spirit's scale. The ultra-low-cost model that Spirit helped popularize is judged too fragile to survive in a sky owned by 4 giants. The cheapest way to cross America quietly stops existing as a real option. The college kid, the grandmother, the worker on a tight budget all discover the same thing at the same time. The door is a little higher off the ground than it used to be. Which road we take won't be decided by Spirit. Spirit is already gone. It'll be decided by whether anyone still believes it's worth being the cheapest airline in a market that punishes the cheapest airline. Before we draw the lesson, the disagreement deserves a fair hearing, because Spirit's collapse turned into a political fight almost immediately. Critics of the merger bloc argued the judge is what doomed Spirit by trapping a company that had nowhere else to go. On the other side stood people who had supported blocking that merger, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, who pointed instead at the war. In her words, spiking fuel prices from Trump's war was the nail in the coffin for a carrier that had already gone bankrupt twice. Both readings hold a piece of the truth, and neither is fully satisfying. The most honest version is simpler. Spirit was already sick long before the war, and the war is just what finally stopped its heart. Outro. Spirit's real lesson was never about airplanes. It's about any business whose only edge is being the cheapest. When low price is the only thing you sell, you survive exactly as long as your costs behave. The moment they don't, there's nothing underneath you. The strangest part is that Spirit may have been right about its customers all along. Over the years, millions of Americans wanted the cheapest possible seat. Now they have one fewer way to get it. Here's the question worth sitting with. Was Spirit a bad business, or a business that gave people exactly what they asked for, at a price that could never last? Tell me which road you think we're on, and if you want to see what happens next to cheap flying, stay close.